Most people don't realize this, but one of the most resilient vegetables ever grown on Earth doesn't need fresh water. It doesn't panic when the soil turns salty. It doesn't collapse when conditions get harsh. In fact, it thrives where most crops fail completely. And yet, if you walk into a grocery store today, you won't see it labeled as a superfood. You won't see it pushed by agricultural giants. You won't see it subsidized, mass-marketed, or even mentioned in most food conversations. Not because it doesn't work, but because it does. I've been studying plants like this for a long time. Not casually, not through headlines or trend cycles, but through hands-in-the-soil testing, old agricultural records, obscure research papers, and conversations with growers who don't show up in glossy documentaries. And one thing becomes very clear once you've been around long enough. When a plant solves too many problems at once, it often disappears from the mainstream story, especially if it doesn't fit neatly into industrial farming models. Think about how fragile most of our food system really is. Crops that demand perfect soil, constant irrigation, chemical inputs, and protection from even minor stress. We've normalized that fragility to the point where we think it's unavoidable. Salty soil, consider it dead. Coastal land, write it off. Brackish water, useless for agriculture. That mindset didn't come from nature, it came from convenience. And it came at the cost of forgetting plants that never needed ideal conditions to begin with. What makes this topic especially interesting is that salt-tolerant vegetables were never a fringe idea. Historically, they were common knowledge in coastal regions, arid zones, and delta civilizations. These weren't novelty crops. They were survival crops. They fed communities where traditional farming couldn't function. And for a long time, they were quietly effective until modern agriculture decided efficiency meant uniformity. I remember the first time I encountered one of these plants in the wild. No labels, no marketing, just growing effortlessly in soil that would kill lettuce in a week. It wasn't struggling. It wasn't stunted. It looked comfortable. That's when the question hit me. If this thing grows where nothing else will, why don't we talk about it? And more importantly, why don't we eat it? The common explanation is taste, or yield, or market demand, but those answers fall apart the deeper you go. Because the truth is, this vegetable doesn't just tolerate salt, it uses it. It incorporates it into its structure. It grows crisp, mineral-rich, and surprisingly versatile. And nutritionally, it punches far above its weight. Not in a flashy, influencer-friendly way, but in a quiet, foundational way that actually matters if you're thinking long-term. Before we name it, it's important to understand the category it belongs to. These plants are known as halophytes species that have evolved to grow in saline environments. That alone should make anyone in agriculture pause. We're living in a time when soil salinization is increasing globally due to irrigation runoff, rising sea levels, and climate shifts. Entire regions are becoming harder to farm every year. And yet, the plants specifically adapted to these conditions are treated like biological curiosities instead of solutions. I've tested several halophytes over the years. Some are genuinely impractical. Some taste awful. Some grow slowly or inconsistently. But one of them stands out. Not because it's exotic, but because it's simple, easy to grow, easy to harvest, easy to integrate into food systems without reinventing everything. And that's what makes its disappearance so strange. Let's talk honestly about how food trends work. Superfoods don't rise because they're the best, they rise because they're profitable. They need branding potential, export scalability, intellectual property angles, or at least processing complexity. A plant that grows easily in salty soil doesn't need fertilizer, doesn't require genetic modification, and can be harvested by hand without specialized equipment. That's not a corporation's dream. That's a self-reliance nightmare for the wrong people. Over the years, I've seen this pattern repeat. When a plant empowers individuals, reduces dependency, and doesn't lock farmers into supply chains, it tends to stay out of the spotlight. Not banned. Not suppressed in some dramatic way. Just quietly ignored. Research funding dries up. Extension programs don't mention it. Seed distribution becomes niche. And before you know it, people assume it was never important in the first place. What makes this vegetable especially fascinating is that it wasn't forgotten everywhere. In certain regions, parts of Europe, Asia, and coastal communities, it never vanished. It stayed on menus. It stayed in local markets. Chefs knew what to do with it. Farmers understood its value. But it never crossed over into global consciousness, even as we started panicking about food security and sustainable agriculture. I've cooked with it. I've grown it. I've compared it side by side with popular leafy greens under the same conditions. And the results are always the same. Where others struggle, this one performs. Where others need correction and care, this one adapts. And yet, if you search for best vegetables to grow, it's almost never mentioned. That omission isn't accidental, it's systemic. At this point, you might be thinking this sounds like hype. Another hidden plant they don't want you to know about. I get that reaction. I've had it myself. That's why I don't deal in miracle language. I deal in trade-offs, and this plant has them too. It's not perfect. It's not going to replace wheat or rice. But it was never meant to. It fills a gap we've decided to ignore. One of the biggest myths in modern nutrition is that progress always means replacement. In reality, resilience comes from diversification. You don't solve fragile systems by doubling down on the same inputs. You solve them by reintroducing forgotten ones. And this vegetable fits that role almost too well, which again raises the question of why it is absent from mainstream discussion. Midway through my research, I came across old agricultural trials from decades ago. Quiet studies, minimal follow-up, promising results that went nowhere. The language was cautious but clear. High mineral content, low input requirements, adaptability to marginal land. Everything sustainability advocates claim to want. And yet no continuation, no scaling, no push. That's when the name finally matters. Because once you say it out loud, a lot of things click. The plant is Salicornia, often called sea asparagus, samphire, or glasswort depending on the region. And if you've never heard of it, that alone proves the point. Salicornia is not a new discovery, it's ancient. It grows along coastlines, salt marshes, and saline flats across the world. It doesn't fight salt, it embraces it. The plant stores salt in its tissues, which is why it has that naturally briny flavor people compare to the ocean. But here's what most people miss. That salt comes packaged with trace minerals, fiber, and compounds that make it nutritionally dense without being calorie heavy. From a grower's perspective, Salicornia is almost unsettling in how little it asks for. No fresh water? Fine. Poor soil? Fine. High salinity that would kill conventional crops? Ideal. And that should immediately trigger a larger conversation about land we've written off as useless. I've grown Salicornia in conditions where spinach bolted early, lettuce burned out, and kale refused to establish. Same sunlight, same neglect, different outcome. That's not magic, it's evolution. This plant evolved for environments we're now rapidly creating through climate pressure and poor land management. And instead of leaning into that adaptation, we're acting surprised when conventional crops fail. In culinary terms, Salicornia is often underestimated. People think salty vegetable and imagine something unpleasant. But when prepared correctly, blanched, sautéed, paired with fats, it's crisp, clean, and incredibly versatile. Chefs who use it don't treat it as a gimmick. They treat it as a seasoning and a vegetable at the same time. That alone should make it more popular than it is. So why didn't it catch on? Part of it comes down to control. Salicornia doesn't require chemical fertilizer industries. It doesn't rely on patented seed systems. It doesn't scale neatly into monocultures without losing some of its advantage. It thrives in decentralization. And modern agriculture is built on the opposite assumption. Another issue is perception. Because it grows in harsh environments, it was never romanticized. No pastoral imagery. No rolling green fields. Just marshland and salt flats. And that matters more than people realize. Food marketing thrives on aesthetics, not resilience. At this stage, I want to hear from you. Had you even heard the name Salicornia before this? Or is this the first time it's crossed your radar? Drop a comment, because I guarantee the responses will split between people who've known it forever and people who are stunned it exists at all. As we move forward, the next part of this story gets even more interesting. Because Salicornia isn't just a forgotten vegetable, it is a case study in how solutions can exist in plain sight while we chase complicated fixes. In the next section, we'll break down its real nutritional profile, its limitations, and the myths that stopped it from going mainstream. Not speculation, not hype, just what holds up when you actually test it. And if you want to explore this further on your own, I've linked a few solid resources in the description, nothing flashy, just places where the real data lives. Because the truth about this plant isn't hidden behind secrecy. It's hidden behind disinterest. Once the name Salicornia enters the conversation, the tone usually shifts. People expect either a miracle or a gimmick. Neither is accurate. What this plant actually represents is something far more uncomfortable for modern food systems: efficiency without dependency. And that's why it deserves a closer, more honest breakdown, starting with what it actually delivers nutritionally, not what social media would like it to be. On paper, Salicornia doesn't scream superfood. It doesn't dominate a single metric like protein or vitamin C. Instead, it does something more subtle and arguably more important. It concentrates minerals that are increasingly missing from modern diets: magnesium, potassium, calcium, iodine, and trace elements absorbed directly from saline environments show up consistently across tested samples. This isn't fortification. This isn't enrichment. It's biological accumulation, and there's a difference. One thing I always caution people about is chasing isolated nutrients. Nutrition doesn't work that way in real life. What matters is context: how compounds arrive together, how they're absorbed, and how they interact. Salicornia's mineral profile comes bundled with fiber and naturally low calories, which changes how the body processes it. You're not just dumping salt into your system. You're consuming a plant that evolved to balance osmotic pressure internally. That distinction gets lost in shallow discussions. Now let us address the biggest misconception head-on. It is too salty to be healthy. That sounds logical until you actually test it. Fresh Salicornia contains salt. Yes, but significantly less sodium than most processed foods people eat daily without thinking twice. And unlike refined salt, this sodium arrives with potassium and magnesium, which alters its physiological impact. This is the same reason traditional diets built around mineral-rich foods didn't experience the same cardiovascular issues we associate with sodium today. I've run side-by-side comparisons with common leafy greens. Gram for gram, Salicornia isn't an everyday bulk vegetable, and it's not supposed to be. It functions more like a hybrid between a vegetable and a seasoning. You don't replace spinach with it, you complement spinach with it. And once you understand that role, its value becomes obvious rather than confusing. Another myth worth dismantling is the idea that Salicornia is difficult to prepare. That reputation mostly comes from people who treat it like lettuce. Raw, unprocessed, straight from the marsh, it can be intense, but that's user error, not a flaw. A quick blanch removes excess surface salt. Light sauteing brings out a crisp texture similar to asparagus. Pair it with fats, acids, or grains, and suddenly it stops being salty and starts being balanced. Chefs figured this out decades ago. Home cooks, understandably, didn't because no one taught them, and that gap matters. Foods don't become mainstream because they exist. They become mainstream because people know what to do with them. Salicornia never had that bridge built for the public. From a farming perspective, this is where the story gets even more interesting. Salicornia doesn't just tolerate saline soil, it improves it over time. Its growth alters soil structure, reduces surface salinity in some conditions, and creates microenvironments where other plants can eventually survive. That alone should have made it a darling of land restoration projects. Instead, it remained siloed in academic journals and pilot programs. Why? Because improvement over time doesn't fit quarterly metrics. Industrial agriculture isn't designed to heal land, it's designed to extract yield quickly. Salicornia asks you to think long-term, to work with marginal land rather than abandoning it. That mindset clashes with systems built on speed and scale. There's also the uncomfortable truth that Salicornia grows best where agriculture historically didn't invest: coastal marshes, saline flats, areas considered unproductive or undesirable. And once land gets that label, it stays there, no matter how many solutions quietly exist. I've spoken with growers who experimented with Salicornia years ago and stopped not because it failed, but because there was no market pathway. No buyers. No distribution. No education. You can grow the most resilient crop on earth, but if no one knows how to price it, sell it, or cook it, it stays niche by default. This is where people often jump to dramatic conclusions about suppression. The reality is less cinematic but more revealing. Salicornia wasn't erased, it was neglected. And neglect can be just as effective as opposition. When funding dries up, when universities move on, when extension services focus elsewhere, knowledge quietly fades. At this point, ask yourself something honestly. How many foods do you eat regularly because you truly evaluated them, and how many because they were simply there? Availability shapes belief. If something isn't visible, we assume it's irrelevant. Salicornia fell victim to that assumption. I want to pause here and throw this back to you. Have you ever eaten something that completely changed your understanding of what normal food is supposed to taste like? Something that made you question why it wasn't more common? Drop it in the comments. Those stories matter more than trends. There's another limitation that needs to be addressed, because ignoring it would turn this into fantasy. Salicornia doesn't store well fresh. It wilts quickly if mishandled. That alone makes it a poor candidate for long-distance mass distribution without processing. And modern food systems rely heavily on shelf stability. If a plant doesn't like sitting in a truck for days, it's already at a disadvantage. But here's the twist: local food systems don't have that problem. Short supply chains don't need extended shelf life. And that's exactly where Salicornia shines. It's a plant designed for proximity, not globalization. And again, that's not a weakness, it's a mismatch. Processed forms exist, of course. Pickled, dried, powdered. Each has its uses, and each changes the nutritional profile slightly. But once processing enters the picture, costs rise, simplicity drops, and the very advantage of the plant starts to erode. Which brings us back to the core issue. Salicornia works best when people are closer to their food. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about practicality. As fresh water becomes more contested and arable land more stressed, crops that don't compete for those resources will matter more, not less. And yet policy, subsidies, and research pipelines are still anchored to the assumption that conventional crops are the only answer. Once you stop looking at Salicornia as a vegetable and start looking at it as a system disruptor, its absence begins to make sense. Not in a conspiratorial way, but in a structural one. Food systems, like any large system, reward predictability, standardization, and control. Anything that doesn't fit cleanly into those categories isn't rejected outright. It's simply left out of the conversation. Industrial agriculture is optimized for crops that behave consistently across millions of acres: uniform height, uniform harvest windows, uniform response to inputs. Salicornia doesn't behave that way. It adapts to micro conditions. It responds to local salinity levels. It grows differently depending on tidal influence, soil composition, and water mineral content. From an ecological perspective, that's a strength. From a spreadsheet perspective, it's a liability. I've seen this play out repeatedly. When researchers propose pilot programs for halified agriculture, the first questions aren't about nutrition or resilience. They're about mechanization, yield predictability, and market scalability. And if the answers aren't immediately clean, interest fades. Not because the plant failed, but because the model couldn't accommodate it. This is where the conversation often turns toward subsidies. Conventional crops aren't dominant because they're inherently superior. They're dominant because they're supported financially, logistically, and politically. Infrastructure is built around them. Equipment is designed for them. Insurance models assume them. Salicornia sits outside that ecosystem, which means adopting it requires adjustment rather than repetition. Large systems resist adjustment by default. There's also the issue of intellectual property. Many modern agricultural investments revolve around ownership: patented seeds, proprietary inputs, controlled genetics. Salicornia doesn't offer much in that department. It's genetically diverse, regionally adapted, and difficult to lock down without undermining its resilience. That makes it unattractive as an asset, even if it's valuable as a food. None of this requires malicious intent. Systems don't need villains to behave predictably. They simply follow incentives. And the incentive structure we've built rewards dependence, not independence. Another layer that rarely gets discussed is perception. Foods that rise to prominence often do so because they can be marketed aspirationally. Think about how many superfoods are framed exotic origins, rare harvesting, ancient secrets. Salicornia doesn't fit that narrative. It grows in mud, in salt marshes, in places most people associate with wasteland, not wellness. That visual alone keeps it out of the spotlight. But perception can change quickly when necessity enters the picture. We're already seeing regions struggle with freshwater availability. Soil salinity is increasing in irrigated farmland worldwide. Coastal erosion and sea level rise are reshaping arable land maps. These aren't future problems, they're current ones. And plants like Salicornia sit quietly, already adapted to exactly those conditions. I've worked with growers who didn't set out to be pioneers. They turned to Salicornia because they ran out of options. Their soil got saltier. Their water became less reliable. Traditional crops stopped making sense. And what's telling is that once they crossed that threshold, they didn't look back. Not because Salicornia was perfect, but because it was honest. It grew where it said it would grow. This brings us to a deeper truth that often gets glossed over. Resilience doesn't look impressive at first glance. It looks boring. It looks uneventful. Crops that don't fail dramatically don't generate headlines. They just keep going. And in a culture addicted to breakthroughs and disruption, that kind of quiet reliability gets overlooked. At this point, it's worth asking, if Salicornia had been discovered today instead of centuries ago, would we treat it differently? Would it be framed as a climate solution? A sustainable protein alternative? A regenerative agriculture breakthrough? Probably. Timing matters more than merit more often than we'd like to admit. I want to bring this back to the individual level because that's where change actually starts. You don't need permission from a system to grow or eat something different. You don't need subsidies to experiment in a small plot, a coastal area, or even a saline-affected backyard. The knowledge barrier is lower than people think. It's just buried under assumptions. If you've ever felt like the food conversation is missing something like we keep recycling the same solutions while conditions keep getting worse, you're not wrong. We're stuck optimizing within a narrow band of options. Salicornia represents what happens when you step outside that band. Let me ask you something directly. If a vegetable could grow with saltwater, improve degraded land, provide minerals most diets lack, and require minimal inputs, what would stop you from trying it? Is it access, knowledge, habit? Or simply that no one ever told you it was an option? That question matters because it applies far beyond this one plant. When forgotten plants re-enter the conversation, it's rarely because someone suddenly discovered them. It's because conditions changed enough that ignoring them stopped being comfortable. History shows this pattern over and over. Foods dismissed as marginal during times of abundance quietly return when systems are stressed. Salicornia isn't waiting for validation, it's waiting for relevance, and relevance is shaped by necessity, not trends. What this plant really exposes isn't a flaw in modern agriculture, but a bias. We've trained ourselves to value optimization over adaptability, yield over resilience, control over cooperation with natural conditions. Salicornia challenges that mindset simply by existing. It doesn't ask the environment to change for it, it changes with the environment. That's a philosophy as much as a biological trait. The most important lesson here isn't eat more sea asparagus. It's understanding why something so practical fell out of favor in the first place. When systems grow large, they narrow their focus. They repeat what works until it stops working. And when that happens, the solutions aren't always new technologies or engineered fixes. Sometimes they're older, quieter, and already proven just inconvenient to reintroduce. I've watched enough cycles to know how this usually goes. First, a plant like Salicornia gets labeled interesting. Then it gets labeled niche. Eventually, when conditions demand it, it gets relabeled innovative. Same plant, same biology, different context. That's not progress, it's rebranding. There's also a personal angle to this that doesn't get talked about enough. The more centralized food systems become, the less agency individuals feel. Growing or choosing foods like Salicornia isn't about rebellion. It's about reconnecting decision-making to reality. What grows where you live? What works with the resources you actually have? What doesn't collapse the moment conditions shift? This is especially relevant as more people talk about sustainability without defining what they mean by it. True sustainability isn't about perfection. It's about continuity. Can something keep going when conditions worsen? Salicornia answers that question quietly, without asking for attention. If there's one myth worth leaving behind, it's the idea that progress always looks advanced. Sometimes progress looks like humility accepting that nature already solved problems we're still trying to engineer our way out of. Salt-tolerant plants aren't futuristic, they're ancient. And that's precisely why they matter. I want to bring this back to you one last time. After hearing this story, does Salicornia still feel strange, or does it feel obvious? Does it feel like a novelty, or like something that should have been part of the conversation all along? Let me know in the comments. Those reactions tell me more about the state of our food culture than any report ever could. If you want to explore this further, the resources in the description go deeper into cultivation, history, and real-world use. Not because you need to act, but because understanding options changes how you see problems. And once you see alternatives, it's hard to go back to thinking there aren't any. So here's the final takeaway. The question isn't why Salicornia disappeared. The question is why we assumed it didn't matter. Because plants like this don't vanish, they wait. And whether we turn back to them by choice or by necessity says a lot about how well we're actually paying attention. If this kind of deep, grounded exploration is valuable to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe. This channel isn't about hype or quick fixes, it's about understanding what actually works and why it was overlooked. And if you want to continue this thread, the next video dives into other forgotten plants that thrive where nothing else will, and what they reveal about the future of food. Because resilience doesn't announce itself. It just keeps growing.